You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary. For nearly 150 years, Calvin Seminary has been a thought leader in Reformed faith and scholarship. We invite you to join us and our guests as we wrestle with the questions of mercy, justice, faith, and formation. We do not have all the answers, but we believe how we pursue them matters. This is the Forum Podcast.
In this episode, Leah Jolly, MDiv and ThM student at Calvin Seminary, sits down with Dr. Karin Maag to discuss Maag's reception of the honorary doctorate from Theological University of Utrecht. Dr. Maag is the director of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies and adjunct professor of History of Christianity, and she also serves as co-director of the Master of Theology program. This honorary doctorate recognizes her contributions to the field of Calvin and Reformation studies, especially through her work in the Meter Center for Calvin Studies. In this interview, we learn more about her life, her entrance into the field of Calvin studies, and the ways her career has led to this honorary doctorate.
We've talked about brain health.
Exactly.
Dr. Maag, thanks so much for being on the Forum Podcast today. I'm excited to get to know your story a little bit better and talk about this honorary doctorate. Just kick things off with a nice, easy question, if you will. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about your faith journey. How did you come to faith in Christ? What was that path like for you?
So I grew up in Canada, in Montreal, and we were members of the United Church of Canada, which is Canada's largest Protestant denomination. It's a mixture of Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. And honestly, I don't remember a time when I wasn't part of the church and a follower of Christ, right? That isn't something I have. I don't have a moment to say, woohoo, I came to Jesus. Yeah. I don't have that. What I do have is a long tradition of being actively involved in church with my parents, and then as a teenager, as a young adult. And I really found church and faith to be very supportive and strengthening for me, especially when I was a teenager. I was shy. I wasn't very happy at school. I found church and faith to be a very big source of comfort. And I really built a lot of my faith at that point, even though there wasn't, as I said, a moment of like coming to faith that I would point to. I was confirmed as a teenager, so profession of faith, if you want. That was obviously very memorable and very significant for me. But it's been a process through my life. I can't really point to a specific moment.
No, I love that. And sometimes it's, thank God that we don't necessarily have that one big moment, but rather that gradual upbringing in the church. And that's just as great.
A tradition of faithfulness,
yes,
right?
Yes, absolutely.
And that's very valid as well.
Yep.
Right.
I have that as well, and I'm very thankful for it, even though, you do kind of battle that comparison in a sense of like, I don't have that good conversion story. But it's like the Lord is just as honored in the non-crazy ones as he is in those kind of crazy ones. No, but I love to hear that. So tell me a little bit about how you came into academia. You have a PhD from the University of St. Andrews, and you're here at Calvin Seminary, Calvin University. You're directing the Meter Center. But I'm assuming that probably didn't just happen overnight. So tell me, how did you kind of come to Calvin, and what was that path into realizing like, oh, I want to be in academia?
So I come by it honestly because both my parents are professors.
Okay.
Right? So we've got that in the family. My mother taught psychology. My dad taught statistics. And I'm one of three siblings. I'm the only one who went on into higher education. But it certainly was something that the family was very comfortable with and knew the path. And really my parents as mentors and examples. I mean, they're really amazing examples for me. My mother was the chair of her department at a time where women were not, it was just women coming into academia in terms of teaching, not a very common thing. I really admire and respect both my parents highly for what they did and what they achieved, and it was a model for me as I was going forward. I liked school. I liked academic work in high school. I really flourished in university. I did an undergraduate degree in Montreal, really enjoyed it, a double major in religious studies and what they called the liberal arts program, which was like a great books program. That was wonderful.
I love that.
And I knew that I wanted to go on for a master's degree. I thought that would be something I'd like to do. I thought about doing it in history. I applied to various Canadian programs in history, and they all said, well, you haven't done an undergraduate degree in history, so you have to do a qualifying year, right, to catch up with the courses you haven't had. I didn't really feel like doing that. I figured I'd done my undergrad. I wanted
Yeah.
to go right on. So I applied to programs in Britain because I thought, well, that could be different and interesting. And my
Yeah.
parents were willing to find support for me for that 1 year. And so I applied to a number of British universities. And most of them wrote back and said, thank you for your inquiry. You're now dossier number 762 or something like that. The University of St. Andrews wrote me back a real letter. They said, Dear Ms. Maag, here's what we have. Here's what we could offer. We have a master's degree in medieval and Renaissance studies. Maybe you'd be interested. And I couldn't go in person to check it out. But even just that letter and that sense that they were seeing me as a real person made it enticing. So I thought, okay, 1 year, this is great. I'm going to go. And it was amazing. I was 20 and I left home for the very first time. It was amazing. I tell you, when I went through the passport control at the airport in Montreal, I almost turned around and went home. It was just so stressful. Like leaving my family is like, help.
Yeah.
But it worked. It worked. It was really interesting, really fascinating. And in that first year of my master's, the 1 year I was going to do, the person who became my PhD supervisor said to me, had you ever thought of doing a PhD? And I said, no, I hadn't. And he said, well, you should consider it. So I thought, okay. The problem was the funding, right? Because I was Canadian in Britain. I have to pay foreign student fees. It's very expensive. So I prayed about it. And I said, well, Lord, here's the deal. If you want me to do this, we have to be able to find the funding. I can't ask my parents to pay this. We have to figure this out.
Yep.
And it turned out there was a scholarship in St. Andrews. It was called the Howard Mitchell Postgraduate Fellowship. And when you're a graduate student in Scotland, they call you a postgraduate. It's confusing, but don't let it worry you. So there was a Howard Mitchell Postgraduate Fellowship, and it was for students in each of the faculties in turn. Like 1 year it was Faculty of Arts, the next year Faculty of Theology, next year Faculty of Science. And you had to be from Canada, Brazil, or the West Indies because he had done research in all those places. He was a botanist.
Okay.
And the year I applied was precisely the year it came to the Faculty of Arts, and I was Canadian.
Wow.
And the things came together, and I received the fellowship. And suddenly I had my fees paid and a living allowance as well. And I said, okay, Lord, I think I'm in the right place. Here's what you want me to do. So I went to do the doctorate. And once you've done a PhD, you're kind of on the academic track. Like, this is where you're going to be going, right? So I did a postdoctoral fellowship after completing my PhD. I did that in Switzerland. And then I started looking at positions where to apply. Professor Richard Muller, who's emeritus professor here, was at a conference and met my supervisor. I'd finished my PhD by then. Told him that there was an opening at Calvin College and Seminary at the time for the director of the Meter Center. My supervisor came back to Scotland, said, I think you should apply for this job. And I'm like, really? I knew nothing about Grand Rapids. I didn't know if it had an airport. You know, I'd never lived in the States. I had nothing to go on, really.
Yep.
But I thought, well, I'll apply. I'll be an outside candidate, but I'll apply. And I did. And they interviewed 3 people. I was the third they interviewed, and I was the one they selected. So I came to Grand Rapids in 1997, and I've been here ever since.
Wow. So how many years were you at St. Andrews in total?
I came in 1989 to do the 1 year program, and then I started the PhD in the fall of 1990. And I completed my PhD in 1994.
Okay.
So the British PhD goes really quick. They don't do coursework. They don't do comprehensive exams.
Yep.
You do essentially your thesis,
Yep.
and you're dropped in at the deep end.
Yeah.
And it's really good for the self-motivated and those who can really make progress on their own without a lot of hand-holding. And I flourished. I absolutely loved it.
What was your dissertation on?
Higher education in Geneva in the 16th century. I was trying to establish whether the Genevan Academy that John Calvin set up was in fact intended to be a seminary or a university, right? There's 2 different models of learning. The seminary, train the pastors, focus on theology, you know, that kind of thing. A university, a broader outlook, broader perspective, more areas of discipline, you know, fields of study and so on and so forth, different mindset. Which one was it? I looked at the first 60 years of the Genevan Academy. So I read a lot of minutes and documents and letters in the Genevan archives, which was a lot of fun, actually.
That sounds fascinating.
It was cool.
So then when you were in Switzerland for that postdoc, what was that continuing to focus on your dissertation or a little bit different?
Kind of. What I did was I moved on to look at especially what was going on in Zurich, which is the other main big city in Switzerland. And so they had a really interesting system in Zurich. So Geneva's strategy was this. We'll hire the best professors we can find to be at the Genevan Academy. And if they're expensive, well, never mind, we're just hiring them. This is good. And, one professor was so expensive, he was told, his salary was so high, he was told not to tell his colleagues how much money he was getting because they'd all want more. And the city couldn't afford it. The city paid the salaries of the professors. Right?
Interesting.
And money was not coming in student fees. Student fees were very minimal. So the city's really investing, and it's trying to hire the best possible professors. That was Geneva's model. For my postdoc, I studied Zurich's model, which was completely different. Zurich said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to go in a bidding war for the best professor. We're only going to hire our own citizens. So you have to be a citizen of Zurich to teach in their academy. They paid them proportionally lower salaries because these are boys of the city. So why do we need to pay them a lot of money? In the money they saved, they offered travel scholarships to their own students to study elsewhere. So I tracked the careers of these peripatetic students. One student had money for 9 years, and he traveled to Heidelberg and Marburg and Vienna and, taking a few years here, a few years there, a few years there, and then get recalled to Zurich to be a pastor. Absolutely fascinating.
That is so interesting. And 9 years of funding?
9 years of funding. Parents had to sign, fathers had to sign as essentially guarantors that their son would eventually serve the Church of Zurich as a pastor. And if not, if the son changed his mind, the dad had to repay all the scholarship.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty good incentive for people to follow through on their commitment. That's so interesting, though. Thank you for sharing that. So you come to Calvin College and Seminary at the time. You're hired as the director of the Meter Center. Tell me about life at Calvin since you've been here. I know what you've taught has changed. You've been in that director position, but you're teaching at the university a little bit. You're teaching at the seminary. What have you taught, and maybe what research has kind of been a highlight since you've gotten here? So
when I came to Grand Rapids in 1997, I came to be director of the Meter Center, but that has always been a half-time position. So if you think 50% of my work is director of the Meter Center. So the question is, well, what would be the other 50%? When I came, they said, well, you could teach at the seminary or in the religion department or in the history department, those two at the university. Well, I couldn't really teach at the seminary because I wasn't ordained. Like I couldn't go into a faculty position at the seminary, at least not at that time. Yep. So that was an out. And I really liked history, so I said, well, I'll teach in the history department. So in the first probably 15 years, I taught history half-time at the university, then the college, and then I ran the Meter Center. So I had a half-time teaching load and a half-time lead the Meter Center role, right? In 2011, I made a change. So my husband is British, and in order for him to work in the States, I'm Canadian, he's British, neither of us are American. It's complicated to work in the States. Yep. So I had a visa to work here, but under the terms of that visa, he would not have been able to work if he had come with me. He would be my dependent and would not be allowed to work. That's just the way the visa system works.
Yeah, okay.
So he stayed in Scotland. We were married in 1995. So I came here in 97, right? He stayed in Britain, continued his research. He's a marine biologist. Okay. And by 2002, he'd gotten a job in the States. Wonderful. Yeah. But it's in Georgia, right? Not in Michigan. Yeah. So in 2011, I went to see the provost at the university, and I said, I'm thinking of quitting because my husband and I want to be together, before we hit the retirement home. We'd like to have some time together. Yeah, absolutely. And the provost at the time nearly cried, and we had to find a different solution, right? They didn't want me to leave. Yep. So, okay, new solution. I'll keep doing the Meter Center. And I went to half-time at that point, only did the Meter Center. And the way it would work is that I could do the Meter Center's work. If I did 115 working days here in Michigan, then I could spend the rest of the time in Georgia where my husband was. So half-time consolidated into half a year. Does that make sense? Do you follow that? Okay. But I miss teaching, and a half-time position is not the best in terms of your benefits, right? I didn't get health care. Which was a problem. Yep. So no, health insurance is not great. I could go under my husband's policy, but that's complicated. So I've started teaching at the seminary instead. And I've been doing that very regularly now for the past 5 or 6 years, and I really love it.
That's awesome. How have the classes you've taught kind of connected to your research, and then maybe how have they kind of pushed you outside of those bounds a little bit too?
So I've taught a lot of different things. I teach research methods a lot, which is directly connected to my work in the center in terms of making sure that people are able to find resources, know how to use resources, know the difference between a primary and a secondary source, and which you use how, and how to analyze texts and so on. Yep. That's entirely in my wheelhouse. That's the kind of thing I do as director of the Meter Center. When people come in with a project or an idea, I'm helping them. That's the kind of work I'm also training our students to be better at, the THM and PhD students especially. And then I'm a social historian of the Reformation. My passion is finding out what was the lived experience of people in the 16th century, right? I mean, we know there's Calvin and Luther and Zwingli and all the other lead reformers, and we read their texts, and that's all very good, right?
Yeah.
But I'm interested in figuring out, well, how does that implement in practice, right? What does that look like on the ground? And to do that, then I can teach classes on, say, the Swiss Reformation or the Huguenots in France, or just this semester on the Puritans and the Dutch Nadere Reformatie, or I'm going to do a class on Scotland, the Reformation in Scotland. So that allows me to introduce the students to the field, the sources, the primary readings, the secondary sources, and all that can help also strengthen my scholarship. So I started out, my PhD, as I said, was on higher education, so I'm really interested in that. The training of pastors, that's been a passion of mine. Church-state issues, how does that work in practice? Worship is another area I'm really interested in, the history of worship. I published a book called Worshipping with the Reformers, and it looks at different facets of worship comparatively. That was that was probably the most fun book I wrote, because I get to put in actual vignettes of historical events on each area. So there's prayer and preaching and the sacraments and going to church and being at church and worship outside of church. And each time it starts with 2 or 3 actual real stories from the time. And it's a lot of fun.
That is so fun. Now I want to read that book. So as a researcher, and I've even felt this a little bit too, it can be isolating. It can be lonely. How do you work to bring your research and bring your interests into conversation with other people and kind of avoid that natural isolation or loneliness that might come from research?
So one thing I'm very committed to, and I do that with my students as well, is I tell them research is actually a collaborative effort, not a solitary effort. So I want to cultivate in our students and in myself an awareness of, okay, this is what I'm interested in, but I have connections with these people and I know what they're working on. So as I read and I come across an article or a book or a source or something like that, I jot it down and then I send an email to the person I know is working on this. I said, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's this, article or book or source or something, and I thought it might be helpful, right?
Yep.
And I want to cultivate that in our students as well, that we're really not in competition with each other. There's enough room for everybody, right?
Absolutely.
And if you see something that you think someone else should know about, it could be a fellowship opportunity, it could be a conference coming up, it could be a call for papers, a journal is asking for something. Think of those around you, right?
Yeah.
And build this community of scholars. That's really what I'm interested in. So that's part of what helps. And then organizing conferences, workshops, lectures, seminars. We do this at the Meter Center all the time. And bringing in people, that's really been excellent. To have the Meter Center as this sort of nexus point for work on Reformation studies has been wonderful.
I love that. You're mentioning the Meter Center, and my understanding is it has a very, very high international reputation, both Calvin scholars and others alike. What about the Meter Center kind of gives it this reputation and makes it so unique? You've talked about you're bringing in speakers, you're bringing in presenters, you're helping facilitate people's research, but what's making it unique and giving it such a reputation?
There aren't too many places that have a combination of the collection we have, which are the books, right, and the articles and the digital resources and the rare books and the whole thing, like that purpose-built collection. And also the opportunities for fellowships, right? We have people come to us to do research, and we offer short-term fellowships. We're now up to, I think, about 200 people that have had fellowships from the Meter Center over the past, 20 years.
That's incredible.
So these are people from all over the world, every continent except Antarctica. We've had visiting scholars. And they come to us. They experience what Calvin Seminary is all about. Our hospitality, our willingness to help, and they go away as almost ambassadors for us and build up our reputation without us really having to do much more than being kind, hospitable, welcoming, helpful, right? And they go away as some of our best ambassadors and spread the word. So we don't have to do a whole lot beyond making sure that everyone who comes here has an amazing experience. And then you find that the word gets out, right? I mean, this past year we had visiting scholars from the United States, which kind of you'd expect, from Romania. Who knew about Reformation studies in Romania? But this is a professor at the Pentecostal Institute in Bucharest, Romania, who discovered that a Romanian text from the 16th century has actually been taken partly from the work of a Swiss reformer called Wolfgang Musculus. And he identified it, and he came to us to sort of investigate more the Musculus side of this and find out about, how this text might have eventually emigrated towards Romania in the 16th century.
That's fascinating.
Which is, unique.
Yeah.
And then at this very moment, we have a visiting scholar with us from Myanmar, from Burma, right?
Yep.
Again, not a place where you think Reformation studies,
Yeah.
right? But he's doing a PhD at Singapore, and he's with us for a month doing research to complete his dissertation on John Calvin, which is just amazing. And those contexts then perpetuate themselves.
Absolutely. You mentioned you guys have a pretty big book collection.
Mm-hmm.
How does that come to be? How do you get so many very rare, almost out of print, never to be found again sources, and how do you get them here?
So it depends a little bit. There's different avenues. There are rare book dealers, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are on the market. They sell you rare books, and often they have acquired books from, I don't know, a professor or a pastor in Europe dies, and his widow sells his books, and then they come on the market, and the rare book dealer knows we're interested in Calvin and puts those items in front of us and says, would you like to buy them, right? Sometimes they come by donation. Some people have a book, an old book they don't know what to do with. No one in their family wants it, and they contact us kind of out of the blue. That's happened a number of times. And sometimes it's just a matter of being attentive to what's out there. And again, the more our name gets out, the more people think of us when they have these kinds of events happening. The core of the collection certainly predates me, predates other people who have been active in the Meter Center in the past 20 years. The original vision for the Meter Center was crafted by a professor at what was then the Bible department at Calvin College called H. Henry Meter. That was his name. That's why we're the Meter Center. And he had a vision for a Calvinism collection because it's Calvin College, right?
Yep.
So that would kind of make sense. And that vision was not realized during his lifetime. But after he died, his family and others on the faculty perpetuated that idea, created the core of this collection, and we've built it up from there. The center opened in 1982, so we're coming up on 35 years, and that's pretty amazing.
That's wonderful. And you've been there for a good portion of those 35 years at this point.
Yep. Actually, hang on. It'll be 45 years, won't it?
Oh,
82
45?
to 22 was 40 years. So coming up to 45 years.
Awesome.
Yep.
Yeah. See, I can't do math on the spot.
That's okay. Me neither.
But even as you think back kind of over your time at the Meter Center so far, and even looking towards the future, what is exciting about the work that you get to do there every day?
So what's really interesting is you never know who's going to walk through the door. Right? What's their idea?
Yeah.
What is their question? What are they interested in? And sometimes the door is an electronic door, not a literal door, right? They'll email us and they'll say this or that. I have this issue I'm working on. And again, you don't know what they're interested in or why they're contacting you, but suddenly you're investigating or exploring something. Some of it is a bit needle in the haystack. Like someone emails you and says, I heard that John Calvin said this, and they give you a quotation. Can you tell me where he said it? Well, that can be a little bit hard because Calvin wrote a lot of books. And so sometimes we're playing around and trying to figure out where might it have come from.
Yeah.
It's easier now than it used to be with all of digital sources, but even so, that can be a challenging hunt.
Absolutely.
Some of the more peculiar ones was a person contacting us convinced that they were a direct descendant of John Calvin.
Okay.
Since he had no living children, this is a little challenging. So we had to work with them and try and figure out why they thought this and on what grounds and so on and so forth. It used to be, it hasn't happened as much recently, but it used to be we'd get some very angry emails from people who didn't like Calvin at all, John Calvin at all. And they would write to the university and say, how dare you call yourselves Calvin University? Don't you know Calvin was a terrible man? And those emails would be forwarded to me as director of the Meter Center to try and answer them. And sometimes the person was open to conversation and sometimes really not. Sometimes they just wanted to vent.
Yep.
Other times we could kind of have a conversation about what happened in the 16th century, how to understand it, not trying to defend Calvin at all costs, because there are things that happen that are really terrible, right? But to say, okay, let's try and understand this event in its context and know that obviously there was great harm done, but also in other times great good. So how do we weigh this together?
Yeah, I love that. Shifting gears a little bit, you have a very important event coming up in a few weeks. You've received an honorary doctorate. This is not something that people just put their names in for. Can you talk me a little bit through what was it like to find out about it and What's the celebration going to look like? What are you looking forward to?
So in January, this past January, so January 2024, I was actually in Georgia at the time with my husband, and I opened my email kind of on a Monday morning, and there was an email from the Netherlands, from the Theological University of Utrecht, and I thought, okay, they're asking me to join a committee. They want me to, give my opinion on an article, something like that, something very academic-like, right? So I opened the email, and it was from the man who's the president of that university. He's not called president. His title is Rector Magnificus, the Magnificent Rector, which is a wonderful title. Anyhow, and it said, "Dear Dr. Maag, blah, 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 we'd like to offer you this honorary doctorate." And I started laughing, and I said to my husband, "You got to see this. This is unbelievable." And I knew him, so I knew it wasn't like a prank or a spoof or a spam or something like that. That this was a real deal. So Utrecht, the Theological University of Utrecht, it's only recently established in Utrecht. It was in Kampen before. It's moved fairly recently.
Yep.
It's not a huge institution. I don't know even what their student body is, but it's certainly not much bigger than Calvin Seminary. I mean, it's not a huge place.
Okay.
And they have every 5 years, they celebrate what they call their Dies Natalis, kind of like the seminary does here, right? So every 5 years, they have a big celebration, and they offer honorary doctorates to people at that time.
Wow.
And so 5 years ago, I believe it was 5 years ago, Richard Mao got an honorary doctorate from them, as did Masako Suzuki, who's the director of the Bach Collegium in Japan, the big choir, right? They got an honorary doctorate. So, there's people in the past who've had this, right?
Yep.
And so I'm now the first woman to get an honorary doctorate from this institution.
That's awesome.
It's definitely good.
Congrats. I love it.
And I met actually at my most recent conference in Toronto, the 16th Century Studies Conference, I met a professor from the Theological University of Utrecht, and she told me she was the one who put my name forward. So that was very nice.
Oh, my word.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
So it's essentially for services to the field of Reformation studies. That's what it's for, right? Because they think that what I've done has contributed significantly to the advancement of Reformation studies, the creation of networks, the basically fostering of Reformation studies. And that's really a wonderful thing.
I don't disagree. I think it's wonderful. It's beautiful. You're traveling to the Netherlands. What are you looking forward to the most about being there in this whole celebration?
It's going to be very interesting. I mean, I'm waiting to see how this actually goes.
Yeah.
So I'm flying out next Tuesday night. I'll get to the Netherlands Wednesday morning. I'll take a train from the airport in Amsterdam to Utrecht. That's not a long or complicated train trip. And then I'll be in the hotel getting over my jet lag and so on and so forth. The ceremony's on Friday afternoon. So I get there Wednesday. I have until Friday to kind of clear my head and so on and so forth. And so it's happening in one of the big churches of the city. Many of the Dutch churches now don't necessarily have congregations anymore, but they are civil spaces. So you have big events there, concerts and so on and so forth, and academic ceremonies, apparently, right? So I'm told I have to be there at 2:30. They are giving me a gown. I don't want to have to pack an academic gown, so they're going to lend me one. I did warn them that I'm not that tall compared to Dutch people, so I don't want to be floating in something, right? I'm waiting to see if I'm going to have a funny hat. I presume I will, but we'll just wait and see. And then, so the ceremony starts at 3, and I know the rector is going to speak on the state of the university, which is kind of what you expect. And then they've asked me to speak after that on my topic, which is the pastoral care for the sick and the dying in Calvin's Geneva. And then there'll be a dinner that night. That's what I know. But beyond that, I have no idea. We'll wait and see.
There's probably some surprises in store you have no idea about. So you're speaking about pastoral care in Reformation Geneva. What prompted you to choose that topic of all topics?
So again, I'm really interested in the lived experience of people in the 16th century. And one of the things that was hardest for people when they switched from being Catholic to being Protestant was the ceremonies that they had when they were Catholic at these major life events, right? So the sacraments are one touch point. And then one of the ones mainly is when you're really sick or dying, right? If you were Catholic, there was a ritual. There's last rites, right? The priest comes, he anoints you with oil, he hears your final confession, he gives you the viaticum, which is the consecrated host to kind of feed you on your journey to heaven and so on. It's got a ritual. The Reformation happens and the Reforms swept that away. It's like, we're not doing that. That's not happening. So I wanted to know, well, okay, then what? How did that work? How did people respond? What was that like? And so I wanted to explore the experience of being seriously ill and dying in Calvin's Geneva. And I discovered a fair number of resources. I wanted to know what was the thought behind what was available in terms of pastoral care, what were the problems, and how did, how were things taught to people, like what they were supposed to do at their deathbed or how pastors were supposed to behave. And I found a lot of resources, including some really interesting letters by John Calvin, who said that although it was not Geneva's practice, he himself thought that bringing communion to the sick and the dying, the seriously ill and dying, was a very important idea. And I thought, I want to emphasize that, because there are conservative Reformed traditions today that won't allow that, that say that's not allowed. And I wanted to figure out, well, why does Calvin say it is allowed? Like, what's his rationale here?
So what did your study reveal on that? Essentially,
he sees it as part of the duty of care and the strengthening of the person who is seriously ill or dying in their spiritual struggle. Like, he takes that spiritual struggle seriously that people undergo when they are very seriously ill or on their deathbed. And he said what the Lord's Supper does, partaking in the Lord's Supper, strengthens them, assures them of Christ's presence with them, and that we should not take this assurance from them. That's really, really important. And I have to say, for me personally, in my work as an elder in my church, some of the most moving spiritual and strongest spiritual experiences I've ever had was celebrating the Lord's Supper around the bed or the chair of someone we know is in their last days. Yeah. It's an amazingly powerful experience.
And what makes it so powerful in that particular context?
I think because for the people who are experiencing this, it's not okay, we'll just have communion now, that's fine. Yeah. To them, it speaks to their core beliefs, right? This is the body, this is the blood of Christ. I am remembering, I am partaking, I am sharing in this. It's a sign of community. It's a sign of identity, right? This is who I am, right? It speaks to people who may themselves be in a weakened condition that they can't themselves articulate their faith anymore. But in these symbols, in these elements, their faith is proclaimed to them in a way that they recognize.
Absolutely.
So I can give you an example. Our pastor recently went to one of the nursing homes, senior homes around Grand Rapids, and we have a number of our congregation who are living there, including a couple where the woman has Alzheimer's, basically, and she's not completely non-communicative, but almost, right? Yeah. She'll say hello and goodbye, but that's about it, right? And otherwise she just kind of sits. So they had the Lord's Supper with the elders there and the people who were from our church who live there, right? Yeah. They're passing the bread, and then my pastor had like a quiet time after receiving the bread. And this woman, who otherwise doesn't speak, popped her eyes open and said, "Where's the wine?" Okay, so she knew what was the next step. She knew this meant something. This spoke to her, something that she couldn't have communicated in any other way. You could have asked her as many questions you want theologically. She didn't have those words. Yeah. But what she had was a complete awareness of what this was, what the parts are, and what came next, right? Yeah. So she was that expectant believer. And that needs to be fostered. That needs to be fed. And that's why I think it's so important.
I love that. That's a beautiful example. You shared a little bit you shared your presentation with us at the monthly mini colloquium hosted by Dr. Tianto last week. And what struck me as I listened is it seems like you've sought to make your work deeply scholarly, but also very accessible, that it's not just your fellow peers that are listening and saying, yeah, I understand it, but there are students from every program in there also saying, yep, I totally get where you're coming from. I understand the process. So you're making it accessible to a lot of people on a lot of different levels. How do you do that as a scholar? How do you cultivate that level of accessibility as a scholar?
I mean, I'm fortunate, right, that my area is something that people are kind of automatically excited by because it's the life of people. And who's not interested in the life of people? Right? Absolutely. Think of blogs or things like that where people spend time telling you about their life. And people are drawn to that, right? That's interesting. You want to know more. Yeah. And so I've been able to have a field that is already of interest to people. And they want to know, well, hey, tell me how that works. Like, what was that like? Yeah. I think that automatically builds connection. And then I've also honed this skill because through my time at Calvin, I've also taught for the Calvin Academy for Lifelong Learning, for Aquinas' program called the Osher Living Learning Institute. So these are general public enrichment sessions, often
Yep.
for seniors. So I've taught on all sorts of subjects, and it's one of my favorite things to do. So you have a room full of people, like imagine your grandparents, okay?
Yeah.
And they're there because they want to be there. They don't have to take a test. They don't have to, write a paper. And they have all the enthusiasm of first graders. Like you ask a question, all the
Absolutely.
hands go up like,
Yep.
oh, this reminds me of the time my wife and I were in Paris. And sometimes the stories go kind of offline, but
Yep.
but it's all good. It's all excitement,
Absolutely.
engagement, and so on. And I've had the real benefit of being able to teach for these programs, short, like this 3-week, 4-week programs once a week.
Yeah.
On all sorts of topics. I've done Reformation-related things. I've done other history topics. And you get to know how to present the content in a way
Yep.
that people can really relate to.
Yep.
And so that's something I've been able to do, and I've really enjoyed it.
And it comes with a lot of practice and a
Yep.
lot of honing that skill. Definitely doesn't happen overnight. On the flip side of that, you have people that are really excited about history. And I say who wouldn't be excited about history, right? But there may be some listening to this podcast that may be thinking, like, why study these deceased theologians? Why study history? What in your mind or what in your view is the impact of studying history and learning from these theologians, even if they lived centuries ago? What implications does all of this have for today and for the church today?
It's definitely important. So what I've discovered, and I think this is probably true in general, is particularly in the church, folks have a knowledge of the Bible, and they have a knowledge of today, but in between there's this big emptiness. Like,
Yeah.
okay, a lot of things happen, but I don't know what, and I can't organize any of it, and
Yep.
so on and so forth. What I'm here to do is to shed light on these this middle ground that people don't know about, to help them make sense of the past. I don't think you can make sense of the present or the future unless you have a strong understanding of the past.
Agreed.
Because you cannot figure out what are options, what are possibilities, what's been tried before, what worked, what didn't work.
Yep.
Even though circumstances have changed, the issues are often very similar, right? So church and state issues are not new, right? It's not like it's a new thing. A lot of people in the 16th century, 17th century, Middle Ages, they all thought about it,
Yep.
right? So let's gain from this. Let's understand where they have come from. Not to say we replicate, right? That's not the point. It's not because Calvin said it that we have to do it today. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that in exploring how past generations have explored these issues, we can start thinking perhaps more creatively about these same problems ourselves. Even just knowing where some of the shoals and the rocks are that might
Yep.
wreck us, right?
Yeah.
Just seeing what worked, what didn't in the past can help inform us as we think about ways forward together.
Absolutely. So as you look towards the future and continuing to shed light on this period of history kind of between the Bible and the present, what's next for you? What are you working on?
That's really interesting. I have a number of projects, and there's always the question of finding enough time to get to them because
Yep.
you get the other things that sort of fill your time.
Yep.
I'm due to write a translation. So as well as doing my own work, I also translate mostly works from French into English, and I really enjoy that. It's a lot of fun. So a colleague of mine has written a book on preaching in the 16th century in Switzerland, and I want to translate his book from French into English. So I
Wow.
need some time for that.
Yep.
For my own work, I'm really interested in how communities, particularly communities that are perceived as somehow different in their surrounding area, how they survive, thrive, and flourish. So this is a problem today,
Yeah.
right? People are trying to say, well, what's the space for immigrants in our society, right? Where do they fit? They come in with a different language and a different culture, and they're not like us, right?
Yeah.
So that's a problem that's also existed in the past.
Yep.
And there's a particular group I'm interested in. They're called the Walloons, Walloons, the Walloons. They are French-speaking Reformed Protestants in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, the northern part, is Dutch-speaking, right?
Yep.
It became its own country by the late 16th century. And the Walloons are French speakers from what's now today Belgium, from further south,
Okay.
and Protestant, right? So they share the same Reformed Protestant outlook,
Yep.
but they have a different language and a different culture. And I want to look at their experience in the Netherlands, right? So Reformed, so the same, but linguistically, culturally different. What challenges does this pose? Does it make them more willing to consider ideas outside the box? Like, are they more theologically flexible? Or do they actually become more like, well, we have to hold the strong line of what it means to be Reformed? Like, where do
Yeah.
you find them on the theological spectrum? And then how do they cope with the challenges of cultural assimilation, right? So you think about the first generation who come, like, we're French speakers, this is great. But our kids grow up and they date a nice Dutch boy or a nice Dutch girl. And what will they do? Well, they'll learn to speak Dutch, and they'll marry the Dutch boy or the Dutch girl, and they'll have nice little Dutch children, and they'll no longer speak French, right? So what's our identity? Who are we, right? And where do we fit? That's what I'm really interested in thinking about. And it's an issue for immigrant communities all the time today as well.
So once again, bringing back that lived experience.
Absolutely.
I'll look forward to reading an article or a book by you on that at some point in the future. But in the meantime, congratulations on the honorary doctorate. Enjoy your time in the Netherlands. And thank you so much for being on the Forum podcast.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed this.
Thank you for listening to the Forum podcast. To learn more, go to theforum.calvinseminary.edu.